Today, we are in the Grayson Highlands and headed up to the highest point in Virginia. Hi, I'm Sky Marthaler. Welcome to another episode of Rooftops of America. Today, we're in the Grayson Highlands State Park and headed up to the rooftop of the Old Dominion. But before we start our adventure, take a moment to click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Located in southwestern Virginia, in Smythe and Grayson counties, Mount Rogers lies in the Jefferson National Forest. The mountain is part of the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area, created in 1966 with a size over 154,000 acres. Within its boundaries are also 4 wilderness areas. One of them, Lewis Fork, is the home of the Mount Rogers Summit. The mountain is part of the 550-mile-long Blue Ridge Range. The Blue Ridge Mountains are part of the much larger Appalachian Mountain Range that stretches from the Maritime provinces in Canada all the way down to northern Alabama. Now the Blue Ridge get their name from the trees that cover the slopes of the mountains, in particular from a chemical that the trees produce called isoprene. It's what gives the range its bluish tint. The Blue Ridge start in northern Georgia and finish in South Pennsylvania. They started to form 1.1 billion years ago and continued to evolve as tectonic plates flexed and compressed over the next 800 million years. They are the oldest mountain chain in the United States and the second oldest in the world, with only the Barberton Greenstone Belt in South Africa being more ancient. Mount Rogers wasn't always the highest point. In fact, throughout its 410-year history, Virginia has laid claim to not only some of the highest reaches in the U.S., but North America as well. Established by charter in 1606, the original boundaries of the colony could be considered rather modest, especially in lieu of what was to come. The terms dictated a stretch of land from 34 degrees to 41 degrees latitude, with territory extending only 100 miles inland from the coast, wherever the colony was established. According to these terms, the first high point of the colony would be right on the 100-mile boundary at Cowherd Mountain in current-day Orange County, Virginia, with an elevation of 1,179 feet. In the early 1600s, the British were playing catch-up in the New World. This was a time when conquest and colonization could basically be summed up as whoever could get there first and then hold it against all comers. Britain's archenemy, the Spanish, had become fabulously wealthy exploiting the riches of North and South America. Their other enemies, the French, were also making inroads in what would become Canada. While Great Britain had some success raiding in the Caribbean, their previous attempt on the North American continent to establish a permanent colony at Roanoke had met with failure. Virginia wasn't founded for religious freedoms or personal liberties. It was founded for people to make money. Those charters issued by the king authorized private individuals to adventure forth or invest their own personal wealth with the prospect of getting even richer. It's sort of the genesis of the term venture capitalism. And for the first decade of its existence, the Virginia colony was an absolute financial disaster. With the colony struggling to establish a foothold in North America, more money was needed. So the Crown issued a second charter to appeal to investors, this one redefining the borders of Virginia and stretching them to the Pacific Ocean. The northern border was on an angle, so according to the terms of this charter, the highest point of the colony would shift thousands of miles away and increase in both size and elevation, to be Denali, Alaska. The boundaries would have also included Mount Logan, the highest point for the country of Canada. In 1619, the Virginia colony finally started to show some financial gains. Tobacco use had become popular throughout Europe, and it gave the colony a cash crop. With this success, new colonies were soon chartered in Massachusetts, New York, and Maryland, which meant that Virginia's northern border would once again be redefined. The high point shifted south, this time to Mount Whitney, California, and at least on paper would remain that way for over 100 years. The Spanish would have strongly disputed this, having claimed California for its own colonial empire. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris concluded the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as it was known here in the colonies. And with that, Virginia's borders were once again redefined. This time, the western border was moved to the eastern bank of the Mississippi. It's at this point that Mount Rogers becomes the de facto colony and later state high point, though its height and its title would remain unknown for another 7 decades. At its greatest extent, at least on paper, the colony of Virginia stretched all the way from Bermuda in the Atlantic Ocean to the shores of the Pacific. From Alaska down to parts of the northern states of modern-day Mexico. It was a huge parcel of land, millions of square miles. But the reality was quite different. For the entirety of the 17th and most of the 18th centuries, the Virginia colony's activities were focused on the easily accessible coastal plain that bordered the Atlantic Ocean. Ideas for expansion were all curtailed by the rugged interior. The Blue Ridge Mountains, like their counterparts, the Alleghenies to the north, would serve as effective barriers containing colonial expansion in the 17th and early 18th centuries, though there were intrepid explorers who ventured into the frontier. The first European to explore the Blue Ridge Mountains was a German named Dr. John Lederer. He was a 25-year-old physician from Hamburg, commissioned by Governor William Berkeley to explore the interior and find a route to the Indian Ocean. Between 1669 and 1670, Lederer would make 3 marches, as he called them, through the area, and would be the first European to see the Shenandoah Valley and spy the Alleghenies beyond.
We went up afoot. The ascent was so steep, the cold so intense, and we so tired, that having with much ado gained the top of one of the highest, we drank the king's health in brandy, gave the mountain his name, and agreed to return back again, having no encouragement from that prospect to proceed to a further discovery, since from hence we saw another mountain, bearing north and by west to us, of a prodigious height.
Lederer concluded that it was not feasible to go any further west, and anyone thinking you could cross the interior of the continent in 8 days was gravely in error. Dr. Lederer wasn't the only explorer charting the interior. Thomas Batts and Robert Fallon would be the first to reach the New River Valley in 1670. And while these explorations help expand the knowledge of the Virginia interior, it'd be another 50 years before any major settlement would take place. Mount Rogers remained an unrecognized giant for decades due to several reasons. The first was the impenetrability of the Appalachian Mountains. It's probably a little bit harder to imagine nowadays, but in colonial times and even the first few decades after independence, this range was effectively a wall, a giant natural barrier of mountains and dense forest. From New York to Georgia, there were only a handful of natural passes to travel through the Appalachians, and of those, only 3 of them allowed animal and wagon travel without having to accomplish any significant feats of engineering. As settlement slowly crept into the area, pioneers with all their personal effects and provisions crammed into the back of Conestoga wagons rolled on down the Great Wagon Road through the Shenandoah Valley, following a path similar to Interstate 81 today. By the latter half of the 18th century, it was said to be the most heavily trafficked road in the Americas. At Roanoke, the Great Wagon Road split. The Carolina Road took settlers south towards Salisbury and Charlotte. The other branch eventually became the Wilderness Road and took pioneers west through the famous Cumberland Gap into Kentucky and later Tennessee. One of the more noteworthy Americans to travel through this area back in those early days was legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone. He came through here in 1760 with a party of long hunters on one of his first journeys to the west. They traveled up from North Carolina and entered Virginia right here at White Top Mountain. The party climbed to the top of the mountain, where they most assuredly spotted Mount Rogers, but made no mention of it in their notes, being more interested in the views from White Top summit that provided an unobstructed look into the valley down below. Besides the rugged terrain, the other limiting factor to expansion was how this land was actually used at the time. This was prime hunting grounds, and it was heavily contested between several powerful Native American tribes, in particular the Cherokee and Shawnee nations. Encroachment by white settlers was not welcome, and at times met with fierce and deadly opposition. This area remained quiet and relatively devoid of settlement for much longer than other places in the state. In 1795, the signing of the Treaty of Greenville effectively removed any Native American claims from Western Virginia. It was then that settlers finally started to make their way to the region. Even then, while Mount Rogers had been spotted, and perhaps even climbed, it wasn't thought of as the state high point. And frankly, neither was nearby White Top. In Virginia's early days, the high point was thought to be elsewhere. None other than Thomas Jefferson claimed it was at the Peaks of Otter. Jefferson was an admirer of the Blue Ridge, with both his homes, Monticello and Poplar Forest, being located near them. He wrote about the peaks and the Blue Ridge in his Notes on the State of Virginia.
The mountains of the Blue Ridge, and of these peaks of Otter, are thought to be of greater height, measured from their base, than any others in our country, and perhaps North America.
Part of this can be attributed to the nature of the peaks of Otter themselves. Flat and sharp tops both appear as distinct peaks, a trait that is even more noticeable with all the ridges surrounding them. Such was their reputation as the highest point in the state, they even provided stones to the Washington Monument. While the peaks of Otter are impressive, their elevation falls well below that of Mount Rogers. Flat Top, the taller of the two, is 1,700 feet shorter. The truth finally came out when Virginia's first state geologist proposed and spearheaded a multi-year effort to form a geological survey of the state. It was during that undertaking that Mount Rogers would finally claim its title as the state high point. William Barton Rogers is one of the giants of American geology, along with his brother Henry, a successful geologist in his own right. They initiated the first geological survey of Virginia in 1835. This was a major undertaking, and for the next 6 years, the Rogers brothers, along with assistants and students, would measure and study the physical makeup of Virginia. They analyzed soils, ores, and water. They collected specimens, fossils, and rocks. They measured the heights of mountains and the lengths of rivers. And in the end, they put together a comprehensive geological map of the state. When this area, and Mount Rogers in particular, were finally studied in detail, what was discovered was unlike anything else in the state. This region's geologic history was an ancient story of fire and ice, occurring with the breakup of the supercontinent Rodinia. First came fire. Around 750 million years ago, Mount Rogers was a hotbed of volcanism, caused by the tectonically created rift that ran through the area. The volcanoes here were a combination, some like Hawaii, spewing forth a slow, thick-flowing lava, others more explosive, like Mount St. Helens. The end result was a slab of volcanic rock 500 meters thick that can still be seen today. This rhyolite bedrock is incredibly erosion resistant, and it's the reason Mount Rogers is the state high point, and, with its immediate fellow peaks, one of the only places in Virginia where you can stand over a mile high. If you head north from here, you won't find a taller peak until the mountains in New Hampshire's presidential range. After the fire came the ice. This is one of the only spots in Virginia where there's evidence of ancient glaciation. Now, this isn't like the glaciers we find around the Midwest high points that came from the Ice Age. This is much older. And if you know what you're looking for, you can find numerous outcroppings around the base of Mount Rogers that help provide some clues to this ancient time period. These rhythmite outcroppings are one of the bits of geological evidence left behind pointing to glaciation. Known as the Nakarada Formation, it took shape 500 to 700 million years ago. Current geological efforts are working to determine if whether this was just glaciation for a high elevation peak, or if it was part of a much larger event. Now there's a couple of clues that you're looking for. You'll notice on this particular formation, if you start at the bottom, it's all in nice orderly layers. But as you start to work your way up, you'll get your first hint that something is amiss. This right here is what's known as a dropstone. Now, this is a larger piece of rock that's quite literally dropped into the formation. What makes dropstones interesting, though, is they're too large to be moved by normal means, like flowing water. So that means it had to be something with more power and force. And back in the days of fire and ice, that meant only one culprit: a glacier. The next clue is this jumble up here, above both the stratified and dropstone layers. This is ancient glacial till, and it's evidence that the glacier came through and bulldozed the area, mixing it all up. It was thanks to the efforts of Rogers and his team that the foundation was laid to start uncovering this history. The Virginia Geological Survey helped fuel the Industrial Revolution of the United States and was instrumental in revealing the geology of the Appalachian Mountains. In a weird little twist, for a work that proved to be so influential, the Virginia legislature never appropriated the funds to get the final report, despite Rogers lobbying almost to his death to get the money to complete it. William Barton Rogers left a legacy in Virginia. Along with his brother, they were instrumental in gaining a fuller understanding of the Appalachian Mountains. Rogers would go on and found the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as well. He passed away in 1882 at the age of 77. The following year, the state of Virginia named the state's highest point in his honor. In a coda, his papers on the survey wouldn't be turned over to Virginia for another 2 decades. Mount Rogers is not only a geological treasure house, but a biological one as well. The height of the mountain and its sister peaks means the weather and the ecosystem here is different than the surrounding area. This is the northernmost peak in the southern spruce fir habitat. Like other peaks in the southeast, the Fraser firs on this one have been impacted by the balsam woolly adelgid. But in the case of Mount Rogers, its isolation has allowed it to not become as infested as the peaks further south. The high-altitude environment also supports a variety of bird species, some not found elsewhere in the state, such as the Appalachian yellow-bellied sapsucker, or vulnerable species like the red crossbill, the northern saw-whet owl, and the winter wren. If you are into bird watching, this is a great place to do it. There is another thing that sets Mount Rogers apart from many of the other high points in the country, and that is the ponies. These Shetland pony descendants have been here for decades, but they aren't just here for looks. They provide a valuable service by grazing the balds and helping control the native hawthorn and other thorny bushes. While the ponies are accustomed to humans, please leave them alone. It's against park policy to feed or pet them. Mount Rogers has a lot to offer, but one thing you won't find when you reach the summit is a scenic view. If you want that, you need to come next door to Whitetop. At 5,440 feet, it's the second highest independent mountain in the state. And its exposed bald is the northernmost one you'll find in the southern Appalachians. On clear days, it is hands down the best view in the state. Now, let's take a closer look at getting to the top of Mount Rogers. Getting to the top of Mount Rogers requires a bit of effort. It's the highest eastern state high point without any roads or pavement leading to its summit. We're going to take the trail here at Massey Gap. It's considered the most scenic, and it's one of the best hikes in Virginia. Alternatives are the Elk Garden Trail from the west and the Mount Rogers Trail from the north. To reach the top of Mount Rogers, it's a 4.5-mile hike, first across the Glacial Highlands and then through the Jefferson National Forest. Now, while the summit is enclosed and wooded, the highlands themselves are open to exposure in the elements. So check the weather and plan and pack accordingly. Let's go check it out. You'll reach the Appalachian Trail early in this hike. Its famous white blazes will be one of your primary guides. Despite Mount Rogers' isolation, its proximity to this grand trail makes it a popular stop for hikers. The exposed areas along the way can be subject to fairly high winds, and make sure to wear the appropriate footwear for the rugged terrain. Bringing the right gear and plenty of water will make this an enjoyable excursion. hike to the summit is one where the old adage rings true. It's the journey, not the destination. The hike across the highlands is one of the highlights of this high point, and depending on the time of year, it can be truly spectacular. A helpful tip as you trek towards the summit: don't forget to turn around, because some of the best views may be behind you. Eventually, you'll enter the Lewis Fork Wilderness, pass the sign, and keep on. In addition to the Appalachian Trail passing through the area, there are also 400 miles of other trails in the vicinity. You could easily spend weeks hiking around the highlands and Jefferson National Forest. This high-pointing hike can easily be turned into an overnight. There are plenty of camping sites along the way. One of the things about this hike is that there are plenty of indicators to let you know you are on the correct path. Thomas Knob Shelter is one of them. The spur is only a short distance further. Once you reach the spur and start heading up, it won't be long before you'll enter into the quiet stillness, almost otherworldly, spruce fir forest. The summit is contained in a small clearing. Visitors will note there are several benchmarks in the immediate vicinity. And here we are on the summit of Mount Rogers, the rooftop of Virginia. Coming in at 5,729 feet makes this the 19th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Skymar Thaler. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Rooftops of America. Before you go, click that red subscribe button below, and I'll see you soon.